All right, and we are back. We're going to continue looking at chapter 7.3 today. So we're going to call this the North Winds Part 2. All right, so we looked yesterday at some battles, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville mainly. Today we're going to look at a couple more significant battles. So here's our learning objective. Today I can explain the events of two significant battles, those being Gettysburg and Vicksburg, that led to the defeat of the Confederacy. All right, so a quick review. What do we know? We know that the Union experienced a lot of success in the Western theater, and we know that Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia scored major victories against the Union in the Eastern theater, including spectacular wins at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. But Lincoln couldn't find a general who could beat Lee. So if you remember back, he had McClellan, then a guy named John Pope, then Ambrose Burnside, and then Joe Hooker. They'd all been beaten. But Ulysses S. Grant was a rising star in the Union Army. He's going to play an important role in the events that are coming up. So here's what we're going to learn today: how Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg changed the course of the war, and how Ulysses Grant challenged Robert E. Lee. And then how Sherman's march to the sea changed war forever. We'll probably get to that next week. And then how the North won and the Confederacy was defeated. All right, so after Chancellorsville, picking up on that big victory for the South in May of 1863, we have Confederate General Robert E. Lee. He makes a decision to invade the North again. Remember, he tried that already at Antietam, and he was defeated and driven back to Virginia then. Lee hopes that a victory in the Northern Territory would compel, meaning pressure the North to seek peace and end the war. And he also was optimistic or hopeful that another Southern victory, especially one on Northern territory, would lead European nations to recognize the Confederate States as an independent country. So the Battle for Gettysburg, this is the end of that, or the climax of that invasion of the North. So Lee's second invasion of the North, he crosses through Maryland, goes up into Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is a small town, kind of on the border with Maryland. And his army was once again outnumbered by his opponents. So Lee has 72,000, and General George Meade, who is leading the Union forces at this battle, had 125,000. The battle was fought over 3 days in 1863, July 1st to July 3rd, and it is remembered. I always thought this was a cool way to explain the significance of this battle. So this is the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. So if you look over here on the left side, the red dashes, they indicate units of Lee's army. So these are the Confederates, the Southerners right here. And this line, the blue, is George Meade. This is the Union Army right here. So the battlefield was a few miles long, and it's been described as being shaped like a fish hook. You can kind of see that right there. So on the first day, it was the clash was relatively minor compared to the next 2 days. So bands of Confederate soldiers entered the town of Gettysburg looking for supplies. A lot of them were looking for shoes, I understand. Instead, they find Union soldiers. They just kind of stumble upon each other, and they engage in conflict. And then the Union Army retreats south from town, waiting for reinforcements. So the next day, day 2 at Gettysburg, on July 2nd, as thousands more soldiers pour into the area, Lee's army pushes Meade's forces around. The South almost captures a crucial hill at the southern end of the line called Little Round Top. It's down here. It's a famous defense of that position between attackers from Alabama and defenders of that hill from Maine. So on the third day, this is the critical day of this battle. So Lee plans a bold attack. Let's go back to that line again. So you have up here, you have Culp's Hill. Down here, you have the Round Tops. A lot of people think that you can explain this long stretch of the line as being like a leg bone, your femur in your leg, your thigh bone. So on the first day, a lot of the battle was up here. Second day, a lot was down here, kind of like in the joints of where your femur would be. On the third day, Lee decides to attack right in the middle of this line, so kind of like along the length of your thigh bone or something. I've heard it described that way before. So he plans a charge of around 13,000 of his own men across an open field, almost a mile of open field, against what he thinks is a weakened enemy army. But you got to remember, though, in July, if anybody's ever been out in Maryland or southern Pennsylvania or anywhere south in July, it's very, very hot. So it wasn't so much of a charge as it was a march across that field. It was too hot to charge. If you charged a mile carrying your equipment and wearing a wool uniform, by the time you got to that the enemy, you wouldn't have anything left in the tank. So here's the problems that Lee is going to experience. He doesn't realize that the enemy wasn't as weak as he thought. And the open field is a long way to walk against rifle and cannon fire. Not only is he going to learn that, but a lot of his men are going to learn the hard way. So this attack by Lee becomes known as Pickett's Charge. It's named after General George Pickett. He's right down here. It's unfortunate that he was given the name for this infamous event right here, because it really wasn't his fault. So right here, this is going to explain. It's a cool video of a guide from the national parks who talks about what happened at Pickett's Charge. It's really interesting. He does a great job of explaining. So here's the results. Pickett's Charge was a complete failure. Half of the 13,000 guys that crossed the field were lost. So 6,000 and more were killed or wounded or captured. Lee accepts responsibility. He says the whole thing was his fault and his mistake. And he actually tries to resign, but President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy won't let him. Gettysburg is a huge loss for the South, and then Lee retreats back into Virginia again. So the Union loses 23,000. The Confederates lose 28,000. I mean, it's 5,000, but they're relatively close. But you have to realize that 28,000 represents 1/3 of Lee's army. And we already know from a couple of days ago that it's really, really hard to get new recruits into the military at this time. So that really puts him behind. So Meade does not pursue Lee into Virginia, which makes Lincoln very angry. It's kind of like an echo of what happened with McClellan earlier. So Lincoln is left wondering, will I ever find a general to finish off Robert E. Lee? Oh, that's a good transition point. So we're going to turn our focus back to the Western Theater right now and look at Vicksburg, Mississippi. So if you remember at the beginning of our study of the Civil War, we talked about the Anaconda Plan, which was a three-part plan for the Union defeating the Confederacy. And one of those parts was the Union getting complete control of the Mississippi River. So I blew up this picture of Mississippi River right here just to tell you, or I want to show you like how the Mississippi River curves and winds like this. We call that meandering. A river meanders. You see the word right here. So Vicksburg is about right here. It looks like it's 2/3 of the way down Mississippi, and it's right on the border with Louisiana. And it's in one of these meandering spots that makes it very, very difficult to assault. So Grant is going to have to be very creative. So floating down the river and attacking Vicksburg was not an option. Only a few boats could make it by. It would be way too costly for the Union. Grant had to be creative, so they crossed the river into Louisiana. And they march down, and then they come back across the river underneath Vicksburg. And then they travel up to Vicksburg from the south and east and attack it initially, but then they lay siege to it. Remember, a siege is where you just surround the place and cut it off so they can't have any supplies. But remember, this is a town. There are people that live in there too, and they're being shelled around the clock, cannon fire and shells. So here's a better drawing of that. So this is the winding, meandering Mississippi River. You can see Vicksburg right there, the fortress. So Grant's guys go across the river and then come back up and fight a series of battles before coming up behind at Vicksburg and laying the siege there. So you got to remember, I said before that this was a town that people actually lived in. This is one just a military fortress. So people living in Vicksburg needed shelter from these cannons. So many of them actually dug caves and lived underground to survive. So the Confederates surrendered to Grant on July 4th of 1863. And here's kind of a funny side note. The South was so bitter, the people in Vicksburg were so bitter about this that they didn't celebrate the 4th of July again until 82 years later. And that would make it 1945, right near the end of World War II. Yeah, that's craziness. So right here, there's a quick video on the episode at Vicksburg. I want you to watch that. So these are turning points in the war right here. So if you notice the dates for Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Gettysburg ended on July 3rd, 1863. Lee loses a third of his army. Lee begins back to retreat back to Virginia on July 4th, 1863. And on that same day, after a 40-plus day siege, Vicksburg surrenders to the Union on July 4th, 1863. So within 24 hours, the South suffers these two terrible defeats. But why are these so important? Why are they considered a turning point? Well, now part 2 of the Anaconda Plan was complete. The Mississippi River was entirely controlled by the Union, cutting the Confederacy in two. Well, what does that mean when we say that? All right, so take a look at this map right here. Confederacy cut in two. We have this blue represents Union territory, red is Confederate territory. Here's the Mississippi River. Now that they have complete control of it, we have the Confederacy chopped in two pieces. So we have Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana over here, and the rest of those rogue states over here. All right, and then Lee's army would also never be the same. He lost 28,000 men, and there were no men to replace them. So he's in a bad spot. That is all for today. Thank you very much, and I'm going to ask that you complete the Google form and submit.